We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
Welcome back to the Mankind podcast, where we're setting out to prove that there's more than one way to be a man. Today, in this interview with Jordan Shapiro, we go into the deep end of the pool around frameworks and understandings of the world, stuff that we might take for granted as the way things are. So questions like, what happens if we decouple ideas about men and women or gender altogether from archetypal qualities? What happens if we bring other lenses to the way that we look at narratives like The Hero's Journey from Joseph Campbell? So I've been captivated by notions of archetypal psychology, also called depth psychology, for many years. And this is Jordan Shapiro's background. This is where he comes from. And I've perpetuated narratives about gender and archetypes that these days are undergoing some fundamental reimagining, all the way down to the way that we make meaning of like the archaeological record, like read The Dawn of Everything if you haven't gotten into that yet. What has seemed rock solid might not be. So Jordan's work challenges me big time to try and unwind some of the assumptions and narratives that are arguably baked into the cake of mythopoetic understanding of the world, which is a perspective that I hold dear. So this hour of conversation may challenge you. Definitely be aware we'll be talking about feminism as a lens to look at the world. We'll be talking about patriarchy as a systemic function at play in the world. Jordan's book, Father Figure: How to Become a Feminist Dad, takes on a number of narratives about parenthood and gender in a way that helps me get to a place where I'm more clear about what I want as a dad. So I want to be nurturing and supporting my kids to have the full expression of who they are, to be powerful and potent authors of their own lives, and to challenge the narratives that might feel sacred and might also be traps. So as my kids get closer to adulthood every day, I want to be standing shoulder to shoulder with them in a world where we are all striving to create a more respectful and more dignity and more agency for more people. That includes you. That includes me. And you know, I'm going to mess that up. I really enjoyed this conversation with Jordan because he's 100% clear that he messes it up too. And ultimately the goal isn't perfection, but it's about relationships where we all can grow. So try it on. I hope you enjoy the conversation. See you on the other side. Hey everybody, it's Boysen Hodgson. Welcome back to the Mankind Podcast. I am so happy to have you here with me today. Today I'm going to be talking with Jordan Shapiro, who is the author of several books, but his newest book is called Father Figure: How to Be a Feminist Dad. Jordan, say hi.
Hi, it's so great to be here. I'm excited for this. This is going to be fun.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it as well. So Jordan is a senior fellow for the Joan Gance Cooney Center at the Sesame Workshop and a non-resident fellow in the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. He teaches in Temple University's Intellectual Heritage Program. Shapiro wrote a column for Forbes on global education, digital play, and family life from 2012 to 2017. His previous book, The New Childhood, received wide critical acclaim and has been published in 11 languages. Father to 2 children and a stepfather to 2 more, Shapiro lives in Philadelphia with his partner, Amanda Steinberg. Jordan, welcome. And the first question that I want to ask you is just to start at the beginning. So this doesn't say a whole lot about some of the intersections that you have, but go back and how did you end up here?
You mean writing a book about feminism for men?
A book about feminism for men with lenses in from all kinds of perspectives. So you have a really intersectional, I'm going to just throw that word right out there, multidisciplinary approach to your writing. So talk about how you came to this multidisciplinary approach.
Yeah, I mean, I studied my PhD is in psychology and specifically depth psychology. So you know the tradition that grows out of psychoanalysis and Carl Jung and the mythopoetic the whole mythopoetic tradition. I don't know if you call it a tradition, but you know, at this point it's old enough we can call it a tradition. That's where my PhD is. What's interesting is that my most of my undergraduate work was in critical race and gender theory, and so I kind of left it after a while, thinking I speak the language, I understand it, I can bring it into my life and live in a way that's very inclusive. I never expected I was going to be doing real serious work, doing research in it, teaching it, and writing about it, and they just sort of came together. At some point, but it was difficult to bring these two worlds of depth psychology and critical gender theory in particular together, because in many ways they, I don't want to say completely contradict, which I argue they don't really contradict, but they have some tension. Let's put it that way. And a lot, I think, of what if you were to ask me what I was really doing for myself and father figure, besides trying to like deal with my own feeling of being a father, which I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about, but in sort of the intellectual game I was playing, or the puzzle I was trying to solve, was how do I reconcile a background in mythopoetic psychoanalysis with a very different way of looking at gender and a very different world. And I guess to make that a little clearer, because I feel like I'm talking really far up here in theory, right?
Yeah.
It is that everything in critical gender theory or queer theory or any of the gender-based theories that I'm working from is really a rejection of gender essentialism. To me, that's the core point, right? A rejection of the idea that there is something essentially masculine and something essentially feminine. That none of those things exist. They're constructed ideas that do more harm and oppress people more than they free people. And of course, I'm guessing most of your audience knows that most of the mythopoetic tradition is really about finding the essential masculine, the essential feminine. Where's your inner princess? Where's your inner witch doctor? Where's your inner wizard? All those things.
Thank you. That's great. And yeah, fascinating segue. So here we are, Mankind Project, Mankind Podcast. Mankind Project emerged out of this mythopoetic tradition, this mythopoetic kind of way of thinking of the world. And even in the time that I've been around it in the last 20 years, the nature of change in our culture, the proliferation of these ideas that we're kind of talking about really has challenged a lot of that. So what I see happening in kind of men's work or mythopoetics these days is a reinterpretation, a reimagining, a relook at a lot of these things and trying to de-essentialize them in some ways.
which is a very hard thing to do. You've read Father Figure, and I think that when a lot of the listeners read it, what they're going to find is that I really had to take on some of these like core ideas core ideas about the hero's journey and go, where are these things? Where do these things have something that is still of benefit to all of us in our personal journey and our sense of agency and autonomy and my inner self, all these questions of who we want to be in terms of feeling fulfilled and free, and then also where are those tropes holding us back and making us live into patterns that we do with good intentions, but they do not serve the world at large.
Good. And let's I'll repeat that. We do with good intentions, but they may not be serving the world at large. So I take for granted that most of us, Brene Brown, right? the hardest thing that Brene Brown had to run into and accept was that people are doing the best they can with the knowledge and experiences that they have. And I have trouble accepting that too. But so where do we go from, let's start with the hero's journey, because I think that's a concept that we've spoken about a lot on this podcast. It's something that's kind of embedded in this, in our culture for sure. Where do we go with understanding a concept like the hero's journey from a more intersectional space?
Yeah, so this is it's a fantastic question, and it's probably the hardest thing that I think I had to grapple with. You know, I first read Joseph Campbell. I think I was probably in my early 20s. I remember reading it, you know, buying it at Penn Station or something and getting on a train and reading and just and I had a sketchbook. I could probably dig out the sketchbook where I'm drawing it out like, oh my God, this changes my whole life. This is right. So I went through this whole experience, and I think I would have, you know, I think even when I started teaching about 10 years ago in the university, I was still planning classes, thinking about it in terms of the hero's journey. But there's also a long a long history of feminist writers critiquing the hero's journey. You know, there's two kind of things that have happened in the feminist response to the hero's journey. One is the adoption of a so-called heroine's journey, right? Not the drug, right? The other kind of heroine. Right? The idea that we can have a feminine version of the hero's journey, which I would argue it really, you know, there's nothing in Joseph Campbell that implies that's possible. That his version is strictly binary and strictly male. And then there's other people who've just said, you know, not only is it strictly male, or I should say masculine. Not only is it strictly, although I think I could do both, or make the argument that it's both gender and sex. That it's just sort of inherently patriarchal in the way that it sets up, and that it's not historically, you know, it's not as historic. While it is historically archetypal, there's that it is only in a post-industrial capitalist economy that we start to think of it as the essential choice. Where I think if you go back to ancient Greece, you see that they of course have the hero's journey, right? They have Heracles, they have Perseus, right? But then they also have an entire canon of other versions of stories which are strictly gendered, because the ancient Greeks are very binary and gendered, but multiple options, not this idea that there is a singular version. And so I kind of take that argument. I think that's where I ultimately have landed on this, is that the hero's journey is still a very useful way for us when we are conforming with the norms, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. I don't mean conforming with the norms like conforming with gender norms. I mean conforming with the norms of living in society, right? When I have to be in a meeting at the university, like I can't be the radical. I want to break everything down and tear everything. You know, there's places where I can be subversive, and there's places where I need to participate, right? And when I'm participating, I think there's still a lot of wisdom in the hero's journey to teach us how to participate in our economy and how to find meaning as individuals. But I also think we need to be ready to be subversive at the same time, and in the appropriate places, of course. That's
beautiful. So it becomes, and this is something that I really enjoy about the way that you deal with storytelling and the way that you deal with kind of cultural approaches from this modern perspective, right? The Campbell story emerged from this like white male centric look on history and anthropology, right? Yeah. But I love how you speak to the practice, right? So the hero's journey as kind of a practice or a model. Okay, here's the threshold. I cross the threshold. I confront things. There will be magical helpers that come to assist me. I will go through a road of trials. I will face an ordeal. I will get the bounty from the ordeal. I will tell the story. Like that can be useful, but then you have to interrogate the kind of automatic meaning making that might come out of that.
Yeah, and I think you have to interrogate what I think a lot of people like to skip, right? Right? Like, we love all the things you just mentioned. Those are stories of perseverance. Those are stories of determination.
Grit's great.
Grit, right?
Yeah,
These are all, and those are all great things, right? Like, I couldn't have the life I had if I hadn't learned determination and grit and perseverance and all those things. But I think what a lot of people like to ignore, and this is where I become very critical of Campbell, is that at the core of this is an Oedipal story about a temptation from the goddess and a confrontation with the father. Often this part's just skipped over. It's just like, then we get to the belly of the whale. We talk about the trials. People like to talk about the magic. They skip the middle, which is the key part that the whole thing is organized around, because Joseph Campbell is writing very much from a Freudian perspective. He believes it. He believes the Freudian psychoanalysis very, very deeply and without question. If you read all his work, you see he does this often, right? He finds Freudian patterns even in non-Western mythology all over the place, which doesn't make much sense, right?
This is something that I noticed on rereading Hero with a Thousand Faces also. It's like, damn, he's cherry picking some stories and really kind of laying a framework over them.
Yes, if he were writing today, he would be accused of cultural appropriation so many times.
Right. Yeah. So,
but again, I don't want anyone to think that I'm diminishing. I'm certainly saying that he's problematic in many ways, but he contributed enormous. Freud also contributed in enormous ways. When you read Father Figure, I think it's pretty clear that I will trash Freud in one chapter and then use him as my explanation in the next chapter, right? Because I think with any thinker, we need to be willing to parse the things that are problematic from the things that are useful. We don't just go, oh, you made one mistake, so therefore we throw out your entire theory.
Beautiful. And it also is, you're using the word problematic instead of using the word wrong, which is kind of, it may be a wrong analysis, but problematic keeps us in the dialogue. Problematic keeps us in the wrestling with the meaning of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't know if they were wrong. They're at least the dead people. I mean, some of them we can, but when it comes to Freud in particular, he certainly. It's hard for us to know whether or not he would say the same thing in a different context, right? And sometimes I read him and I go, oh no, he's just a misogynist jerk, right? And sometimes I read him and go, you know what? If he was writing now, I think he would see the error of his ways, right? Like in some ways, he's way more progressive than anyone writing at his time, right? And so I don't know, and there's no way for me to know. So I have to hold those things as problematic. I will not take them as facts, but I will try to look for if there's some wisdom underneath them that makes sense in a changing context.
Good. Meaning making. So the mythopoetic men's movement, all of this kind of stuff, there's been a large attachment to kind of, we use these stories and myths and metaphors as ways of making meaning. From where you sit today, what's good out there in meaning making for us? Because what am I trying to say? You begin the book and Father Figure was saying, like, look, all the old stories are breaking down. Most of the rigid structures that we have had to rely on, the kind of consistencies and continuities that we thought were going to be in place, they're busted these days. So how are you making meaning in your life?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think meaning making. Obviously, meaning making is not dead. And I think what really changed in my thinking over the years is as I started to read more. I have the I mean, not everyone would consider it a blessing and a privilege, but I consider it a blessing and a privilege to be a university professor, which means I'm permanently in school, right? I get to just like read stuff for fun all the time, which, I know because I have a lot of students who'd be like, I don't want to read for the rest of my life. So I'm not suggesting it's a job everyone wants, but what it means that I just keep on this journey of what other methodologies of thinking. And I think I moved at some point from a mythopoetic stance and put on top of this a sort of, you can call it structural linguistics or semiotics, right? It's the kind of stuff that Roland Barthes does, that Michel Foucault does. And it's this idea that we're always using stories to make meaning, right? It's sort of impossible not to, right? It's not sort of, it is impossible. Like, how could you not be telling the narrative of yourself, right? And how could you not arrive at that narrative of yourself without using the references of other narratives that you've heard before? The question is, which narratives do we take for granted, right? Which are the narratives that we think are unquestionable, and which are the narratives that we're choosing? And what's anytime we start, for me, anytime someone says something's natural or hardwired, or the hairs on the back of my neck go up and go, and I think, well, that's usually what you say when you don't want someone to think too hard about something, when you don't want it questioned, when you don't want it challenged. You say it can't be, right? And to me, that's indication we should be challenging. We should be challenging it. So especially when it comes to questions of gender and gender essentialism, we're told so often that things are natural, like, right, that men are naturally one way and women are naturally another way. And every time I just go, well, first of all, most of the things we say are natural don't make any sense in any context except for our modern context, right? So If you talk about nurture, for example, right, you'll hear people say women it's inherently nurturing, right? Well, what we think of as nurturing and what they thought of as nurturing in the ancient world are totally different ideas, right? So now we know we're just dealing with concepts, right? There's no way that a concept constructed by our brain could be like inherent, right, to who we are. So I think what I'm saying is, of course we have to make meaning, and of course we have to ask questions. That's what I was saying to you a moment ago about the hero's journey. There are times when it's great to use the hero's journey, right? Yes. Right. There's times when it's great to go, hey, I want to have this sense of perseverance. I want to understand the temptation of the goddess, not as a gendered myth, but this idea that I'm going to kind of get stuck in an almost sexual, lustful bliss, right? And I want to understand the father symbolically as a kind of the structures around the world that are that are authoritative and that I need to be willing to question. I think there's ways to do that if you take the gender out of it. And I think ultimately where I landed in terms of Jungian thought, depth psychology thought, mythopoetic thought, is that I just don't think that the gender metaphors are useful anymore, right? Like, I think it's great for us to talk about all of us having inner nurturers. I don't think that it's useful for us to talk about those inner nurturers as being our inner feminine. I think all that does is reinforce the idea that women should stay home barefoot and pregnant and taking care of children, right? And that's really, really, really problematic. So I think, in the context of Freud and Joseph Campbell and Jung and all the other people, that those gender metaphors make sense. That was the world they were living in. Those gender metaphors were taken for granted. Now we know better, and we can still understand the idea that some people have creative potential and some people have less creative potential, but that has nothing to do with your genitals.
Just the silence of letting that sink in for a moment. And to that, all those other characteristics too, right? Like all of those other, the drive, penetrative force, submissive force, like all of these energetic things that get assigned one way or another pretty haphazardly, frequently haphazardly, in my opinion.
Really haphazardly and really prejudicedly. I mean, I think we should say, I think it's very easy for people to make the assumption that the penis is inherently penetrative. Is that how you say it? Penetrative? Penetrating. And the vagina is inherently receiving. But, that's still a construction, right? Like, that's not really true. A friend of mine, Emily Willingham, has a great book called Fallacy, where she looks at penises of the animal kingdom and actually points out that, like, humans have maybe the most flaccid, least penetrative of animal penises, right? Like, we have no bone, we have no spikes, sex. We have no, right? She also points out that there are places where the species that we might, the animal that we might consider to be the female of the species reaches into the male and takes the sperm out. So does the penetrating, right? Like that's not an essential thing. That's a story we've added to our version. Also, there's a lot of feminine. If you look at Luce Irigaray was a French. I mean, I think she's still alive. Was a French feminist author who many years ago wrote about how when you describe the vagina as inherently receiving, you're making it dependent on the penis, right? So it's sort of an inherent, like why don't you consider it an opening rather than something that is designed to hold a penis, right? Because you don't think of a penis as something that's designed to be, you don't define the penis based on the vagina, but we tend to define the vagina based on the penis, right?
That's one of those things, right? That we take for granted, but you really have to interrogate the way that we use the language and the way that we think about these things.
Yeah. And again, then you start to say, how do I want to think about it? When is it useful for me to think about that? It is fantastic to talk about, I think, our inherent ability to penetrate, right? Especially, as someone who works in psychology and philosophy, like I want to penetrate ideas more deeply than I don't know about you, but than most people want to. I'm constantly critiqued for overthinking or let it rest, or you're going, you don't have to get so deep about everything. But that's part of who I am. So I'm all for penetrating energy. I just don't think we can call that male energy or masculine energy.
Thank you. Beautiful. And then just immediately, so after going that deep into the thought and that deep into the thing, what do I have to do? I have to lay back and I have to be able to receive it. I have to be able to submit and receive and take in.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Right. You can't do one without the other. I think a lot of what I get to in I think father figure has so many different threads woven through it in multiple ways, but I think ultimately what I am pointing out that it is really about combining that ability to receive and listen, and to be open and to be, and to find that capacity for nurturing love for all the people in your life around you, while also having many of the characteristics that we might historically associate with masculinity, right? That these are not in conflict, and the only problem is that we have named them as such. And again, not a problem. Like whatever, like it might have worked fine for 100 years ago. We're just in a different world. A lot of people have said to us. There's people all over the world saying to us, you know what, these categories have made me feel marginalized and subjugated, right? There's non-binary folks and trans folks who are saying to us, like, we've been here, and the way you've been talking about these things has made us feel excluded. So we can't be inclusive while also trying to hold on to the things that they're telling us again and again and again are hurtful and marginalizing.
Invisibilizing.
Invisibilizing.
Right?
In some cases, invisibilizing. Yeah, absolutely.
Not present at all in the narrative, period.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I guess it's worth us pointing out that when you say invisibilizing, the point here is that as long as we're in a binary, you're basically telling anyone who doesn't fit in one of these binaries that they are either broken or non-existent.
Or non-existent, yes.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. So before we move into something else, I just want to note that when we're recording is a week, I think, since Bell Hooks passed. And you quote Bell Hooks in the beginning of the book, as well as a number of other folks. Anything that you want to say just about this loss?
If you're enjoying the Mankind podcast, how about checking out an online men's group? Imagine a brotherhood where men really listen and support each other to be the best of who they are. It's free, confidential, and facilitated. Groups are available multiple times every week. Just go to bit.ly/open men's group to learn more.
I mean, it's both a huge loss and also, whenever you have someone who is such a towering figure as Bell Hooks was, it's almost like, I try to not mourn too much because I'm like, I hope that I have contributed that much. Like I'd be ready if I contributed as much as Bell Hooks contributed to our society. So in that sense, I think, she's not gone. She'll never be gone. At this point, Bell Hooks was a huge influence on me. Both her work and I met her many, many times. And just a person full of so much love and acceptance, and and I encourage everyone to read her work and really to read. I think a lot of people in the men's work space stick with Will to Change, which is her book about masculinity. Mm-hmm. I actually find it to be one of her less interesting books. I think she's done great things in that book. I'm not trying to minimize it anyway, but I think there's a lot to learn from her earlier books, like Talking Back and from Margin to Center, and from her later books where she becomes even less feminist. I mean, she doesn't become less feminist, but she starts to write about love. She stops to be so explicitly feminist in her work. And, I think I don't have them all in my house because I keep giving them away to people, but I have read every single thing she wrote. I was introduced to her in when I was an undergraduate, and every time a book came out, I got it and I read it, and it shaped the way it not only shaped the way I think it very much shaped the way I write. Bell Hooks always wrote started everything with very personal stories of her own experience, and then extrapolated that to a broad cultural argument. And I've been doing the same thing, I think, since I read it. The first thing I read by her. I was shocked. I mean, I think I imagined. I didn't imagine her as anyone that was near the end. But when I heard about it, I was shocked and I was saddened. But she'll be with me and hopefully everyone else for a very, very, very long time.
Thank you. Yes, just to acknowledge Black women, just to acknowledge how women have led in thinking about these concepts that were
absolutely. And I don't know. I'll tell you a story. So I was writing. I was writing something this week. It was sort of like to an end of year summer. You write these like, here's what my year was. Here's my blessings. Here's the things that were all those. Yeah. And I quoted Bell Hooks, as I quote her a lot in Father Figure, because she always said, "I'm trying to disrupt the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy." Right. And I used that in the book, but I put in something I put on social media this week in brackets. I wrote the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, and then in brackets I wrote cis hetero and then patriarchy. And I thought, and I had to struggle with this before I clicked send, because I went, now wait a second, I'm a white male. Am I allowed to like add words to Bell Hooks, or is that like inherently problematic for me to be like, I'm going to put words in Bell Hooks' mouth? And ultimately I went with a grammar argument to myself, right? This is what it's like to be me. I have to like have this whole discussion in my own head before I can click send. And ultimately I went, when we use brackets in quotes, what we're saying is this was the term that was implied, but might not have been said. And I really believe that about Bell Hooks is that she thought by saying patriarchy that it implied cis hetero patriarchy. Now we say it, right? And we need to say it to be clear. But I think she really meant it. So I wasn't adding words as much as making sure the implied words were clear, which is what we do when we add things in brackets to quotes. Beautiful.
Boy, we could go down an entire rabbit hole for an hour just unpacking that imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. Yes, we absolutely could do that. I want to move into parenting because, it's painful. And we both fatherhood. And we are both parents of teenagers, and we both have intersections that we are confronting in our parenthood. So, and I'm going to start with this. So if you want 4 sentences that give me an indication of what this book is about and how it's going to challenge your thinking as a father and a father figure. All the research shows, this is page 63, all the research shows that empathetic, child-centered approach to parenting is more effective than a rigid disciplinary one. Everything you've heard about fixed versus growth mindset, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, positive versus negative reinforcement points in this direction. Carrots work better than sticks. Spanking causes more harm than good. Shame leads to long-lasting psychological trauma. So I read that and I think, okay, being a feminist dad is about working with those things. This is what the research shows. This is what we are confronting, is overcoming all of the rigidity, all of the authoritarianism, all of these things. So talk about being a feminist dad.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting you read that section, because when the book first came out, there was a little bit of criticism where people said it seems like you're just arguing to be a good parent equals being a feminist dad, and as you read it, that sort of is the implication in that line. But I think what you need to, and that, by the way, I got that criticism from people on both sides of the partisan political spectrum, the like pro-feminist, and I think what you need to acknowledge is that what years of developmental research has shown us is that less patriarchal ways of parenting are better. And again, that might sound, if you are still stuck in binary gender essentialist ways of thinking about who does the discipline and who does the nurturing, that might sound like it's saying that good parenting is feminist parenting. What I'm really saying is that feminist parenting means letting go of narratives about what it means to be dad, and making sure that you're parenting from a place where you're number one. I don't know if it's number one. I mean, I guess number one is like the survival of our and health of our children. Number two, I think, needs to be our obligation to the rest of the human community to raise good people, right? I am obligated because because of your children, to make sure that I don't put sociopaths out in the world. I think everyone would agree with that. But to me, there's a whole other level, which is I need to put people who are full of inclusivity, love, a willingness to ask themselves hard questions, and a willingness to try to create a more just world for everyone. That doesn't mean they're always going to do it right. I'm not saying I want to we all need to raise kids who speak in so-called woke language, but I am saying that we do need to raise kids that want to guarantee that everyone deserves dignity and are going to work towards a goal and we all screw up at this, right? I'm not, I screw up this. I'm sure you do. But I want kids who recognize that your intention, I want adults. I want my kids to become adults who recognize that your intention should always be to create more freedom and dignity for more people.
More freedom and dignity for more people. Yes. Thank you.
And by the way, we got to remember the global majority, right? The global majority is people of color and people without penises. Right. Like, that's the majority of humans on the planet. That means the global majority of people right now are subjugated, oppressed, exploited, marginalized. That's crazy to me. The majority on this planet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, thank you for that. I want to unpack just a little bit, because we've been using it as we've been using it, both two terms, and kind of taking them for granted, feminism and patriarchy. And I just want to kind of throw the possibility out there to think of these things not as nouns, but as systems, as functions. Mm-hmm. So again, divorcing the concept from gender on some level, right? Patriarchal, narcissistic patriarchal thinking. Right. That I know some women who engage just fine in narcissistic patriarchal thinking and action.
I mean, I think all of us participate in patriarchal systems, right? There's nobody who doesn't. It's impossible to. We are still just trying to imagine the world without a patriarchal system. That's I have dedicated an enormous amount of time and energy to trying to understand it and unpack it and combat it. And I would still be the first. I don't know if I'd be the first one. My wife would probably be the first one to say you're still patriarchal sometimes. So I'd be the second one to say, yep, I know I'm trying every day to not be, but that doesn't mean I'm always succeeding. And I think it's important to make that clear, especially for everyone listening, is that one of the things I tried really hard to do in Father Figure was not to come at it as if I'm the expert, right? Yeah. It is full of the stories of my mistakes, right? Yeah. It is. My first book, The New Childhood, was all about like good stories of how to parent, right? Like, here's all the things I do successfully. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the things that I do successfully. This book, Father Figure, was here's all the places that make me go to sleep with enormous amounts of sadness and anxiety because I realized that I haven't done it as well as I could have, and I have to change something tomorrow to break the pattern. And when I say break the pattern, many of those patterns are what you're talking about, this sort of systemic patriarchal ideas, right? The idea that father knows best, the idea that father's the disciplinarian, the idea that father is always supposed to fix everything. And I don't just mean leaky faucets. I also mean every single problem, right? These ideas are part of a patriarchal system that we all sort of accidentally live into because you turn on the television, right? It's barely changed, right? They'll be like, even if it's a story of two gay dads, there's still going to be all of the patriarchal narratives of what it means to be a good dad, right? Nothing's changed in television. I mean, I love television. I watch lots of stupid shows, but they you don't know how often I'm like, ooh, I can't show this one to my kids. I mean, not that I would stop them from watching anything, but I'm like, if I watch this with them, I'm going to have to deconstruct it. It's going to be really exhausting. I'm going to have to explain the things that are problematic.
Yes. But Jordan, if I don't do that, if I'm not the one who knows, if I'm not the one who fixes, if I'm not the one who controls, if I'm not the one who authors reality, it's chaos, dude. What am I supposed to do?
I have news for you. It was chaos anyway. It was just the meaning making of believing that you were controlling it along the way.
That's yeah, there you go.
But I think it's important. I am certainly not, and I think that you can tell me whether this comes clear, whether this is clearly articulated in Father Figure. I am not one of these flaky hippie, let children be free and you're not in charge. They're supposed to be your best friends. I'm very much there's a clear, there might only be one place where I really believe in hierarchy, and it is actually in parenting, right? The parent is in charge, right? It is our job. If we weren't supposed to be in charge, they wouldn't need parents, right? They'd be able to cross the street on their own. They wouldn't need us to help with their nutrition, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So we are in charge in some sense. The problem is that I like to think of us much more as Sherpas, like we know the path better. We know the dangers that are coming. Our job, I used to say this when my kids were little, right? My job's not to keep them even from getting hurt. It's just to make sure I'm close enough that I can get them to the emergency room when they do, right? That's when my kids were toddlers, on the playground. I was like, they might fall. I just need to be close enough to get to the emergency room, not to stop them from falling.
Beautiful. And advance that into having teenagers, which we both have teenagers. It's no longer so much about falling down on the playground as about falling into thinking patterns and shitty reasoning and poor executive function and all of these other things that we're looking at in a world, oh, by the way, that's, in a pandemic where we're all locked in place together.
Yes. And in my house, it's even worse, I think. I mean, I don't want to say oh, woe is me, I have it worse. That's a terrible thing to say. But I'll just say I spent the first half of the pandemic writing a book about feminism and deconstructing patriarchy and talking about it at the dinner table every night, the things I was learning. And now I have children who are equipped with the tools to be able to point their fingers at me and say that's patriarchal.
And don't it suck?
It's both, when I'm talking to you and they're not here, I am very, 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 very proud. But when I'm on the receiving end, I am very, 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 very wounded. And I think one of the hardest things for people, for cis men and for cis hetero men in the current moment in time is that there's a lot of places where we are in patterns that are problematic and we're getting called out. And for me, the worst thing is when I'm called out, I double down on those patterns even when I don't want to. Like I find myself like at my most patriarchal when I'm also at my most depressed and my weakest.
Yes.
Or when my kids are when they really have me the wall and they're right? Like that's the moment when I start to have problems with having the calmness, the foresight, the metacognitive capacity to reflect on what's going on and go, how do I respond to this? And that's really hard. I don't know. I'll give you a sort of metaphorical example. When my kids were really little, I bet there's a ton of people listening to this with little kids. I remember, I'm not going to do anything with the kind of with the same kind of anger that my own father had until my kids fell down the steps. So then I just reproduced all of the old patterns because I didn't know what to do. I was terrified. And I didn't have time to think what's a better way to deal with it. I just went to immediately became my father.
And isn't that kind of the old stories, right? And that's why the old stories just keep getting reinforced, and that's why Grimm's fairy tales just get boiled down and they keep getting reproduced over and over, because that's the fallback patterns.
And life's scary and life's chaotic, and it's easier to go to the fallback. And sometimes it's the only thing you can do is go to the fallback. This is not... Father Figure is not a book about telling you you're bad for going to the fallback. It's a book about telling you how to reflect on when you have gone to the fallback so that maybe you can make different, better choices in the future. And I try to not even tell you what choices to make, only to give you the tools to be able to make them yourself.
The tools to investigate. Thank you. So I want to touch on the 4 principles. I think that was actually a really nice segue into just touching the 4 principles that are in the book that will help question these fallback patterns. You want to name them? Why don't you name them and just say a few lines about each of them as we keep moving through?
Yeah. So the first one is about critical consciousness. Critical consciousness is a term that I borrowed from the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, and the idea was that people need to be able to think critically. They have to have a critical consciousness about the systems in which they are participating in, and the way those systems are defining the possibilities and the aspirations and the way they think about who they can be and what they can do in the world. Now, when Paulo Freire was writing about it, he was writing about it for the oppressed people, right? Not for the dads who are not the oppressed people. But we are still limited by the systems in which we participate, and we're not necessarily happy with the systems in which we participate. So I'm arguing we need to be conscious enough to be able to say, even this system of patriarchy, which serves me in incredible ways, right? I have white male privilege that allows me to publish a mainstream book about being a feminist and get a very small amount of hate mail and not ever be scared, right? Like that's incredible. Like imagine if I were a black woman, I would not be able to write this book without being scared, right? I'm not scared, and that's male. That's male privilege. I need to be conscious. A critical consciousness means I'm willing to question the fact that this thing that serves me so well might not be just. And also might be limiting my ability to do what's best for my children and myself. So that's critical consciousness. And of course, you also have to teach that to your kids, their ability to do it. The second one is called I called in the book responsive fathering, but we've already talked a lot about gender essentialism. It's a really responsive parenting, but it's a book called Father Figure, so I called it responsive fathering, but it has nothing to do, the key point of this book is that there is nothing gender specific in parenting.
Yes. There you
right?
go.
Right? Like that doesn't mean that it's not good to have two parents who do different things, but it just means that their genitals don't define those things.
Yes.
What I mean by respond, you used my term back to me a few moments ago, the narcissistic patriarchal authority, this idea that we author the story for ourselves and for everyone and for the world around us.
Yes.
Responsive, I stole it from, believe it or not, Stephen Covey. Stephen Covey, is that who wrote what's his famous book? I can't
Seven
think
Habits.
Yeah, the 7 Habits, right? And he just says at one point, responsibility means being able to respond. And so, right. And so I argue in the book that what we need to understand as parents and or fathers is that our job is not to have the authority over our children, which means the ability to author their lives, but rather the ability to respond to our children, which means the ability to do the caretaking they need. Again, we're still in charge, but we do that from a place of responsiveness rather than a place of authority. That's
Beautiful.
responsive parenting.
I just got to throw in something else that resonated
sure.
for me, which is self-biography, right? So we are biographizing our lives, and the responsive parenting, how that connects to, I get to stand with my kids and kind of be in the dialogue and the dialectic about how they are biographizing themselves, how they're creating their lives.
Exactly. And you reminded me, I want to add one more point from that to that responsive parenting, because especially for an audience that's very literate in mythopoetic thinking, which is something I learned from a psychoanalyst years ago, which is that we are all living in colliding myths, which means even though you might be the hero of your own story, you are definitely the villain in someone else's, and the mentor in someone else's,
yes.
and the troll beneath the footbridge in someone else's. And, one of the mistakes we all make, this has nothing to do with father, this is just like people who have bought into the hero's journey, right? One of the mistakes we all make is thinking we're always the hero and then being angry that other people are treating us as the villain, right? But, it's impossible. You're obviously not the hero in your children's story. They're the hero in their story. You are the bad king, right? If you believe in the hero's journey. But I would argue sometimes you are a lot of other things. Sometimes you're the mentor, and it's good to be thoughtful about which role they need you to play and how to play that in a way that's done with the most kindness, compassion, and love. So that's the responsive parenting. Nice. The next one is just a sort of a commitment to getting rid of what I call locker room gender essentialism in the book. But it's the same as the gender essentialism we've been talking about this whole conversation. The reason I call it locker room gender essentialism is at some point while writing this book, I realized that almost everything I believed was sort of essential about men and women was something I learned from some dumb 12-year-old who was telling me how to get laid when I was in a locker room when I was 12. And I still, there's so many that I had never questioned, right? They'd be like, girls like it when you do, and I still had this in the back of my head that girls like it when you do X, right? And it was just so not, I don't even know where they learned it. They could have learned it from an abusive dad. They could have learned it from an older brother. They could have learned it from who knows? But there's so many things that are being talked about in the locker room. And again, I'm not against locker rooms. This is a metaphor, right? There's so many things that are being talked about in this among kids that really get reinforced and we take for granted. And so we need to be willing to question those things. And so when it comes to your family, that means if you're in a typical, I shouldn't say typical, if you're in a hetero marriage, a hetero family, right? Think about the way that ordinary domestic duties are divided, right? Who's doing the laundry, who's doing the cooking, and is it because of your skill set? Or is it because of desire? Is it because you came to agreement? Or is it because of genitals? And I think you'll find there's a lot of things that you're still doing because of genitals. Because let me tell you something, nobody's better at doing laundry than somebody else. It's at this point in history, it's the easiest thing in the world. You drop clothes into a machine, you pour soap in, you press a button, right? There's no skill. Maybe folding clothes involves some skill, but anyone can learn it.
but I want my learned incompetence to play. Why are you letting me off the hook? I don't know how to do yeah, right. I don't know how to.
But
do
again, and
yeah.
it's fine. It's fine if your wife, and I'm using wife because I'm talking about a heterosexual marriage. But if your wife, there's nothing wrong with the idea that one person does it. Just make sure that you've come to an agreement about that, and you haven't just given them that duty because you assumed that all people with vaginas should have that duty, right?
Are you conscious, and are you in relationship about it? Yeah. That's beautiful.
And then the final one, which honestly is the most important one to me and is at the core of probably all the work that I do, I call it rigorous inclusivity. I think some places I call it rigorous inclusivity. Some places I call it comprehensive inclusivity. In the book, I have struggled with which one did I want it to be. They mean different things, right? Like rigorous has to do with rigor and being rigid and being like unmovable in that way, right? And I'm unmovable when it comes to wanting inclusivity. Comprehensive means I want it throughout everything, inclusivity. So both are true. That's the most important one. I wrote this book. I couldn't have, but someone could write a very similar book called How to Be an Anti-Racist Dad, right?
Yes.
Someone could write another book on how not to be an Islamophobic dad. You could write all these things, and they need to all be written. If I were to try to write a book on how to be like a perfectly inclusive dad, that would have to be like 2,000 pages. So I picked one. I picked feminism and decided that was the one I was going to write about. But the bottom line is, as I said already once, and I'll say it again, we need to be committed to making sure that everyone is in. Let me back up. Everyone is entitled to a life of freedom and dignity, and we need to be committed to trying to get it for more people. And that's why I was talking about the global majority, because sure, the world's way, way, way better than it was when I was a child, right? Like way more people have freedom and dignity than they did when I was a kid, right? I've seen it happen. Still, the global majority doesn't. So there's a lot more work to be done, and that's not to diminish or take away from all the great work that we've done. That's not to diminish and take away from everyone listening to this and all the work they're always doing to try to, as you said, right, like they're doing their best with the best of intentions to try to be as loving and caring and accepting and inclusive as they can be. And also, when we look at the data around the world, we're failing. And so we have to keep trying, and we have to keep course correcting, and we have to, we just have to keep trying to be more perfect. I don't know if we'll ever get there, but I know that we have to be trying.
Beautiful. Thank you. We're getting close to the end here. And so do I get to or do we know each other well enough now that I can call you out?
Sure, you can do whatever you want. Yeah. Call me out for what? What I do wrong?
What did you do? Yeah, don't freak out. So here's one thing that I do want to say about the book. I love this book, and I really enjoyed the critical analysis, and I really enjoyed diving into it. And a couple of times you talked about emotional catharsis and emotions and emotional expression in men. And I just got to say, from my own experience of 20 years of being in men's groups and doing men's work, if I didn't have a place to go where I could express that stuff, where it's not going to hurt my kids and it's not going to hurt my wife, and where I can struggle with especially, and here's an archetype that we don't talk about, the archetype of not knowing. Having a place where I can go and struggle with the archetype of not knowing.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree with you on that, and I think it's fair to call me out because I think there's some places where I'm a bit flip about it, and I think I certainly believe in that. I certainly have participated in men's circles myself, and in non-men, and in non-gendered circles. I tend to go to the non-gendered ones at this point, but I've done the men's ones. I absolutely deeply believe in the therapeutic process, whether that's group therapy or individual therapy or whatever version of it. So I'm all for the power of emotional catharsis. I think what I'm hinting at there is that there's a lot of that. I guess I how do I put it? I'm pushing back against what some of those things look like, which are a chance to reinforce stereotypes of masculinity. Like this is a place where I'm allowed to be as much man as I am, and that man is defined in very problematic ways. I'm all for let's go to places where we can be as much of ourselves as we can.
Beautiful. So,
but it's problematic when we start thinking ourselves are a cultural constructed category.
Yeah.
Well, you can beat your chest and be like, if that's who you are, but don't tell me that's who I am, because I'm not. And don't tell me that I'm not going to find my authentic self unless I start beating my chest.
Nice. I got to introduce you to Mark Green at some point, who lives up the road from you in New York City, to talk about deep dive into the man box culture stuff and domination-based masculinity, right? So yes, I love it. Jordan, I have really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too.
I was nervous about talking to you because, you are a very well-researched dude. And I've
I just act that way, I don't have any other way, I don't think my gender or my anatomy gives me authority, so I have to pretend that it's my intellect, but it's just an act.
and we spin all the way back to Jung and persona. Thank you for bringing your persona and playing with me for an hour. So the book is called Father Figure: How to Be a Feminist Dad by Jordan Shapiro. It's on Audible, read by Jordan Shapiro. That's how I got through it the first time, and now I'm reading through it. I would love to have you back again some other time.
I'd love to come back again. Let's do it. You've had a lot of people who I really respect on this show, so I'm really happy to join the ranks.
Sweet.
This has been the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. I have been your host, Brandon Clift, and I personally want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. And of course, I want to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you make it a heck of a lot easier for us to let men out there in the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. Special thanks, of course, goes to my incredible team, Marketing and Communications Director Boyson Hodgson, producer and editor of this episode, Michael Russo, who makes me sound so much more intelligent than I actually am, so of course, special kudos goes there. And if you've been enjoying the music throughout this episode and all of our episodes, check out Jim, Donovan, and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. Now, the fee for this episode is simple. If you found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, remember that life doesn't happen to us, it happens for us, so long as we rip the pen out of fate's hand and become the author of our own story. So my friend, pick up the pen and we'll see you next week. Lots of love.